In today's video, we're going to finish all of the backend work for our author by working on creating the show, update, edit, and delete routes for our author. We're also going to work on creating before actions for our Mongoose models to make sure that our data integrity is kept in check, and look a little bit on how to debug some of the problems that may come up while you're working on creating the backend of your server. Let's get started now. Let's get started by creating our author's routes inside of our author's controller. First route that we want to create here, we're going to do a router.get. This is going to be for showing our user, so we'll say router.get. And for the path, we actually need to pass an ID into this path. So we're going to just say :ID. And this is signifying that after this colon is going to be a variable called ID that is going to be passed along with our request. Then we, of course, just need a function. This function is going to take the request and response. And with that, we are going to do something. In our case, we're just going to do a simple send so that we can see some data, and this says show author. And let's just include that ID in here as well. So we'll say request.params.id. And this params variable right here on the request object is just going to give us all the parameters that we define inside of our URL paths. So in our case, ID is what we've defined right here. So it'll give us the ID from the URL. Next, we want to do our path for our edit page. So this is again going to be a get. And this is just going to be /ID again, because we need the ID of the user we're going to edit, and then /edit. This is just following REST principles for how we define our routes for our URLs. Then again, this is going to take request, response, and inside of here, we're going to do a very similar thing. We're just going to say edit author, and we'll pass along that ID again so that we can see it. Next, we're going to define our update route. And if you remember, in REST, we like to use put in order to define update routes, or anything that updates a resource, we use put. So we're going to use put here, and we're just going to pass along the ID. We don't need to worry about passing along edit or anything, because put is essentially telling us that this is going to be an edit route. Again, we'll do request, response, and inside of here, we're going to print almost exactly the same thing, but this will say update author instead. Make sure this is an actual arrow. There we go. And then lastly, our delete route, we're going to do our router again. We want to use a delete parameter here as our update method. So instead of using put, we're using delete, since that's the REST way of doing things. And again, we want to add an ID in here so we know what resource to delete. And this is just going to be exactly the same, request, response, arrow function. And in here, we're going to say delete author with the ID right there. And you may remember from an earlier video that I said from a browser, you can only make get and post request. So we have no way from the browser to say put or delete. So we actually need to install a library that'll allow us to make these put and delete requests. And that library is called method override. So to install that, we just need to type npm I method override. This is going to install that library. And essentially what this library does is it allows us to take a post form, send that to our server with a special parameter that tells us if we're doing a put or delete request. And then our server will be smart enough to actually call the correct router here for delete or put based on that specific parameter. And to set that up, we just need to go into our server. We need to include that library. So we'll just say const method override is going to be equal to require method override, just like that. And then we want to tell our app to use that. So in here, we'll just say app.use, and we'll use that method override. And we want to tell it what we want that parameter to be. In most cases, you're going to use something like method with an underscore at the beginning, because this is very unlikely to be a name of an input on your form, because this is going to send as if it was an input on your form of underscore method. And this is where you're going to put either the put or delete in your form. And we'll see that when we start creating our edit and delete forms. In order to get this set up and working, let's look at what our existing page should look like for our index. And you see that we have a view, edit, and delete link for our author's search page. So let's go into that author's search page here, index, and let's actually add those links in for each one of our authors. The view link is going to be very easy. We just want to create an A tag. We need to give it an href here, and it's going to be inside that author's route. And then we need to pass the ID of the author. So we'll just do that by getting the author.id here and inputting that in as the end of our URL. And then all we need to do is close this off, give it some text for view, close the A tag, and now if we save that, start up our server, just using dev start here, and we go over to our local host, refresh it as soon as it finishes up, go over to our authors pages, you'll see that we now have our view link. If we zoom this in, we have our view link, and if we click on that, it'll say show author, and it gives us the ID of that author, which as you can see is the same as the ID in our URL. Now let's do the edit link, which is going to be almost exactly the same, but we just need to append edit to the end of our link and change this to say edit instead of view. Now if we go back to this page, refresh it, we can click the edit link, and it's going to edit that author with the exact same ID. And now you may be thinking, to do delete, all we need to do is copy this down, change this to be delete, and that's pretty much done. We can just get rid of this, and now we're deleting. But if you remember, in our authors routes here, we set this up to use that delete keyword here instead of using a get. And the reason you never want to use a get for something that deletes data is because when a search engine such as Google comes and crawls your website in order to index it on the Google search pages, they go to every single get route in your entire application. So every single link that you have here, Google will click on and go to. So if you use an A tag here to delete things, Google is going to click on every single one of them and delete every single thing in your entire application. This has happened to real websites before. Real people have actually done this. They accidentally used a get link for deleting, and then when Google came around, it removed everything from their website. So you never ever want to use get here when you're deleting data. You always want to use delete. The bad thing about doing that though is that we can't actually just use a simple anchor tag here. We actually have to use an entire form to delete something because we need to make sure we're using a delete request instead of a get request. So let's remove this anchor tag and replace it by a form. And inside of this form is where we're going to use our method override that we just installed to actually send a delete request to our server. So first we need to tell our form that our method is going to be post, but this will be overridden by our underscore method. Then we need to give it an action, which is going to be our URL. In our case, we're going to do /authors, and we want that to be appended with the ID, so we're going to get the author ID. Make sure that this is an equal sign here. There we go. And then we also just want to append down our method. So we'll say underscore method after a question mark. This is essentially defining a query parameter, and we'll set this equal to delete. So now when our server gets this request, it's going to see that it's a post request, but it's going to see this underscore method. And since we define that right here as our method override, it'll say, okay, we actually want to do a delete request instead of a post request. And that'll end up calling our router delete method right here. Then inside of this form, we just need to create essentially a button for us to submit this. So we're going to just have a button here with the type of submit. And we just want this button text to say delete inside of it. So in here, we'll just put delete. And this is going to essentially work just like our links that we created up here, but it's going to be inside of a form so that we can use a delete method instead of a get method. Now if we save that, go back and refresh this, you'll see that we have our delete key. And if we click this, we get to that delete route that we created right here. As you can see, it says delete author, and it puts the ID right there. Now this delete request right here is something that we're probably going to do all over our application. So instead of copying and pasting this code everywhere, let's break this out into a partial. So we can go into our folder here for partials, and we can create a brand new one that we can just call delete form.ejs. And inside of this delete form.ejs, we're just going to pass essentially this. So we have our form. Our URL right here is going to be different every single time. So we're going to use something like a variable here to pass in a dynamic URL that we're going to change every single time based on what URL we want to delete to. Otherwise, the rest of this form is exactly the same. Now inside of our index page here, we can just include that form. To include a partial, all we need to do is use the syntax with a hyphen at the end of our % and less than sign. And inside of here, we just call include, and we say what the actual form field we want to include is. In our case, we need to go back one directory, then into the partials directory, and then we want to get that delete form. And there we go, that's our delete form. And then we can just pass it parameters just like we would any other render. So in our case, we want the URL to be equal to this URL right here. So we're just going to pass in this URL as our URL. Let's make that a little bigger so we can see it easier. And we'll indent this. So again, it's easier to see. And as you can see here, we have this author's URL right here being passed in, but we need to use actual string interpolation because this is inside of our server. All the code inside of these brackets right here are run on the server. So these brackets won't actually be understandable. So we just need to do this as if it was just normal JavaScript, and we're going to use string interpolation to make this incredibly easy to work with. And we'll close this off here. And there we go. Now we actually have the author ID being put into this URL, which is the same URL that we had down here. Now we can remove this other form. And if we save this, go back, refresh our page, you'll see we still have our delete button. And if we click on it, it still goes to the correct place. This will allow us to essentially just use this delete form here anywhere in our application by only putting this single line of code. Then if we wanted to change this to say delete to instead of delete, for example, it would just change it every single place that we have that delete button instead of us having to go and change it every place we put the delete code. So let's change this back, save that, refresh, and now we have our index page here looking really good, so we can work on creating our view, edit, and delete pages. The first and easiest page that we're going to work on is the edit page, because this is going to be almost the same as our new page. Let's go back into our routes here, and let's scroll up to our new route, and we're just going to copy this essentially, paste it down here inside of our edit route, because we're going to do almost exactly the same thing, but instead of render new, we're going to render edit, and instead of creating a new author, we're actually going to get the author from the database. In order to do that, we first want to make this an async function so that we can use await inside of it. We're going to get our try catch statement listed up here so that we can catch any errors that happen inside of our MongoDB fetches. Move this back into our try because we want to do this if it's successful. Change this to be an author variable, which we're going to create here. So we're just going to say const author is going to equal author.find by ID. This is a method built into the Mongoose library that all we need to do is pass it an ID and it'll find the author if that exists. So we can just say request.params.id, and this is going to find the user by that ID if it exists. If it doesn't exist, it's just going to catch an error down here where we can redirect our user wherever we want. In our case, we're just going to redirect our user back to the author's index page. Now we can create this edit page. Let's go into our views, our authors, and let's copy our new page because our edit page is going to be almost exactly the same. We'll call it edit.ejs. We want to change this to be edit author instead of new author, and we need to change our action to have the ID of the author at the end. So we're just going to come in here and we're going to say author.id. This way we get our update action instead of our new action. And also we need to make sure that we use this method override so that it's a put method instead of a post. So we can just add that on, make sure we do underscore method, set that equal to put, and now we'll be doing a put request instead of a post request. Also, we can change this text here to say update instead of create since we're just updating a resource, and there we go, we're done. We already have our form fields being defined in this form fields partials, so we don't actually have to worry about copying that code or rewriting it. Now, if we refresh here, you see that we get our edit author section, and you can see that our name is being pre-populated because we took care of that in our form fields section, and we have our cancel button, which brings us back here to our search page. And we're going to change this actually because we want this to bring us back to the actual author page. So in here, we'll just put author.id, save that. Now if we go here and we click cancel, it brings us to the actual author show page, which is much better in our case. Then if we click update, you'll see that it brings us to our update section because it's using method override here with the put to bring us to the correct put request on our server authors page right here. Now with the edit page done, let's work on doing our update page because this is also going to be very similar to our create method up here. So let's actually just copy this create method, bring it down so that we can see the differences between the two. Paste this in here. And the first thing we'll note is we don't want to create a new author. We want to get the existing author. And we need to do that, of course, inside of our try here. So we can just say that we want our author to be equal to author.findById. And again, we're going to pass it the ID that we got from the parameters. And we, of course, need to await this method. And this was going to use our Mongoose database to get the user, the author, by this correct ID right here, and it's going to put it in this author variable for us. Then we can save our author here, and we don't need to save this to a new author variable because it's just going to be the exact same author here. Then, if our code is successful, we can just redirect to this author's ID page here so we can see the actual author's show page, and we don't want to redirect here to the author's index page. We can go up to our post and do the exact same thing. We can uncomment this code that we commented out earlier because now we actually have this route so we can redirect to it. Now back down here in our update, we can get rid of this creating the new author. And we're just going to create a variable called author, which we're just not going to default to anything because we're going to be setting it inside of this try. And the reason that we're setting this inside of the try and not actually just saying const author inside of here is because this author variable we need to have access to inside the catch, so we must define it outside of the try catch to use it. And the reason we need this inside of our catch here is because this code here could fail twice. It could fail here once trying to get the author, or it could fail trying to save the author. So inside of our catch, we actually need to do a check to see if the author is equal to null. Because if the author is equal to null, then that means we failed here, and we were never even able to find an author, so we want to redirect the user back to the home page. So we'll just say res.redirect to the home page here. That way, we don't accidentally try to redirect the author to the edit page for an author that doesn't actually exist. So now we can do down here, we can actually render this authors.edit page, give it an error that says error updating the author, and we just want to pass it that same author. So if the author does exist, we want to do this. We'll say else, of course, so that we make sure that we only do this if the author does exist. Now if we save that, we're getting an error, and that's because we need to make sure that we use async here, since we're using an asynchronous function with a wait inside of it. Also, we want to make sure that we have a backslash here in front of our author's URL so that we say that this is from the root. This is going to be our full URL, because if we leave this off, it's going to be relative, and it's going to be the exact same as if we wrote this, which is obviously incorrect. So let's make sure that we have that slash at the front here. Save this, everything's green, which is great. Now if we go back to our edit page here, we want to edit this to Kyle2, we click update, we now get brought to that show author page, and if we go to our authors page here, you can see that we didn't actually update our Kyle variable, our author never got changed, and that's because, as you can see inside of our code, all we ever did was get the author and save it. We never actually set the parameters that we want to save. So let's actually do that. We want to make sure we change the author name, so we'll say author.name is equal to request.body.name, which is just the name of that field. And now we've actually changed the name before we save the author. Let's go back into our edit, change this to Kyle2, update it, and go back to our authors page. And now you'll see it actually correctly updates the name to Kyle2, which is perfect. Now that we have updating complete, let's work on our delete route, because this is going to be very similar to our update route. We're actually just going to copy all of this code into our delete section, and we're going to change almost nothing. Of course, we first need to get the author by ID, and if this author does not exist, if it fails here, we still want to redirect back to the home page. Now, we don't really need to worry about updating the author name because we're not actually updating anything, and we don't want to save the author. We want to call the remove method. This will actually delete the author from the database for us. And then if this is correct, we don't want to redirect back to that authors page. We just want to redirect to the authors in general. So here we're going to change our redirect to go to the authors page so we can see all of the authors after we delete an author. And then down here, if we failed removing the author, we just want to redirect back to that author. So we're just going to remove this all here, and we'll say redirect to the authors route slash, and we want to do that actual author. So we're going to put inside the $signs here, we're going to say author.id, and of course we need to use backticks here so that we can use string interpolation, and we need to put that beginning slash right there. And lastly, we just need to make this an async function, save this, and now our deleting is already complete and done. But we have one minor problem. You may remember that when we create a new book, we assign a book to an author. For example, let's create a new book and assign it to Kyle2. We'll just give it a title here, any release date, this doesn't really matter, just going to be a placeholder, any description. So now we created this book right here, which is associated with that Kyle2 author, which we have right here. So we don't want to be able to delete this author, because for example, if we delete Kyle2, if we click this and it removes Kyle2, we have books now that are associated with an author that no longer exist in our database. So we need to set up constraints so that it's impossible for us to delete that author that's associated with this particular book here. Otherwise, we'll have a book that's referencing an author that does not exist. So let's set up that constraint, which we need to do inside of our author model here. Mongoose has ways for us to run certain code before or after or during certain actions. So in our case, we just need to use author scheme. And here we put pre. This will allow us to run a method before a certain action occurs. And if we say pre-remove, this is going to run any function that we put inside of here before we actually remove the author. So let's do a function here. And again, we want to use a normal function instead of an arrow function so we can access the author by using this. And then it's going to pass in a callback. We're just going to call next. And essentially, if we call this callback, then that means that our code is going to be okay to go forward unless we pass an error to this next callback. So we'll see an example of that here, but we need to also include our book model up here. So let's include that book model, which is going to be equal to require dot slash. This essentially says from our current directory, which is the models directory, get an object, which is just going to be called book. This is our book.js file we defined right here. So now we actually have a reference to our books, and then we can actually find the books for a particular author. So we can say book.find, and inside of here we pass the parameters we want to search for. So when the author is equal to this author's ID, this means that we have books for this author if anything gets returned. Then we want to run some code. We're just going to do this the standard way with callbacks instead of using asynchronous code. So we'll have our books here, And we have an arrow function. So inside of this function, if there's an error, then that means we had trouble finding this for some reason. So we want to say if there's an error, then we just want to pass that error on. So we'll say next error. This is going to pass the error onto the next function. It's going to prevent us from removing something. And it's just only going to happen if for some reason Mongoose can't connect to the database. So most likely this won't actually happen. But what could happen is if, for example, we have books that get returned here. If this books is not empty, so if we say books.length is greater than 0, this means that for this particular author, there are books in the database for it. We do not want to delete that author. So here we're going to call this next function. We're going to pass it an error, and we're just going to say that this author has books still. And essentially what this error is doing is if we do have these books, it prevents the code from actually removing the particular author. But if none of this is true, so if there's no errors and we have no books, then we just want to call next with absolutely nothing, which tells Mongoose that this is okay to continue and actually remove the author here. Now, after we save that, you see that we get an error, and if we just scroll up to the top, we can see that it says required is not defined, and it tells us exactly where this code is. So if we scroll up, you can just see I accidentally typed in required instead of require. Now if we save that, you see everything's green and everything's working. So now we should get an error if we try to delete the author with this particular ID that's associated with Kyle2, which we assign this book to. Let's go to our authors. We're going to click this delete link, and if it does error out, it's going to redirect us to that author's page. So let's click on it, and you see it redirects us to show author. And if we go back to look at all the authors, you see that Kyle2 is still here, which is perfect. Now let's create a new author so that it has no books associated with it. We'll just call this new author. We'll create it, and we'll go back to the authors list. And now when we click delete, this author should be removed from the database. And we click delete, and you see that it is no longer in our list of authors, and it actually deleted it from the database. It can be incredibly easy to forget to add these different before and after checks for removing things, but anytime that you have data that is associated to one another by ID, you need to make sure you have these remove statements in here to prevent things from being removed if you have other models referencing them. Otherwise, we're just going to have a bunch of books with IDs that point to authors that don't actually exist, and we're going to get tons of errors in our application when we try to view those books. Now that we have all of this done, let's move on to creating our final page for our authors, which is going to be the show page of our authors, which is right here, get by ID. And one thing I want to make sure to note is that this route right here for getting by ID needs to be defined after this new route. And that's because if we define new after this get ID, it's going to think that new is actually an ID being passed along here for a parameter for ID. So for example, we're just going to temporarily move this down here. So now when our server gets a request, it goes from top to bottom. It'll say, is this a post request? Does it look like this? And it's going to say no. Now it's going to say, is this a GET request? Yes. Does it have an ID? So for example, if our request is /authors/new, it's going to say, yeah, there's something right here for this ID, and it'll say our ID is new. It'll never actually get down to this route that's checking to see if it's new. So this is why we need this route for new to be defined above the route for get. Usually I like to put it at the very top, right above our create route. And we can remove this, and there we go. Now our code is working and back to normal, and our new route will still work for authors. So in order to create our show page here, let's actually start by creating the file that we want to use for our view, which we're just going to call show.ejs. And in here is where we're going to put all of our code for viewing the author. And let's go to our application here and look at what this should actually look like. Let's view this author, John. And essentially what we want to do is we want to put their name, links for editing and deleting, as well as all of the books for that author we want to put below this books by author title. So that should be fairly straightforward to do. The first thing we want to do is create our title for our page, which in our case is just going to be our author's name. So we're going to create an h2, and we're going to put our author.name inside of here. And we're going to pass this author variable in from our server, so we can define that all later. And there we go, we have our author name being passed in. And the next thing we want is our two links. So let's do our first link, which is going to be an href here, going to authors/edit. And inside of here, we need to put that author ID. So let's make sure we say author.id. That way we edit the correct author. Close that off, put edit inside of here, and close our anchor tag as well. Next, we want to do our delete form. And remember, we already created a partial for this. So we can just include this partial, which again is going to be inside of the folder here, which is just back2. So we'll say back1 folder, partials/delete form. And there we go. Close off that string. And we want to pass in our URL that we're going to be using. In our case, this URL is just going to be our author's URL. We'll put this on the next line for easier readability. There we go. And we're going to say authors slash, put in the ID here of the author, so it's going to be author.id. And of course, we need to remember to put our beginning slash here. And there we go, that's our delete button already created. And now the last thing we need to do is this books by author section. So down here, we want to first check to see if we have any books by the author. So we'll just use a variable called books by author, which we'll pass in from the server. And we'll check if we have any books by that particular author. So if this is greater than 0 for the length, then that means that we have books for that author. Let's put our opening bracket right here. And of course, remember to put our closing bracket down here for ending our if statement. And inside of our if statement here, we can actually put our header, which is just going to say books by author. Close that off. And the reason we're putting this header inside of this if statement is because if the author has no books, we don't want to actually show this header, so it won't be showing since it's in the if. Then we want to actually go loop over all of the different books for our author. We can just copy this from our books index here because it's going to look exactly the same. So we'll copy over this code, put it inside of our show page here, and instead of using books, we're using books by author, and for each book, we just want to paste down the cover image of that book. Now, if we save that and actually configure our route for our show page to show that, everything will be hooked up. First thing first, let's actually make this an async function since we're going to be using async await inside of here. And then we'll use try catch to wrap all of our code, which could potentially fail. There we go. Now we can define our variables. First, we need to get our author, so we'll create an author variable, and we need to get the books, so we'll create a books variable. And if we fail getting either of those, we're just going to redirect the user back to the home page, so we'll put in that redirect. And the first thing we want to do is get an author. And luckily for us, Mongoose has a great function inside of here we've been using for a while, just called findById. We can pass in the request.params.id, and this will get us an author by ID, and if it fails, redirect us back to the home page. And we can do a very similar thing for books. We can just say await here. We want to get the books, so we'll say book.find, and we want to find them by a particular author. So we'll just say where the author is equal to author.id. This is very similar to the code we used in our delete function to check if the book had any authors. And then we'll say that we only want to get 6 of these books maximum, because if an author has 100 books, we don't want to show all 100 on this page. So we'll say limit this to 6, and then we're just going to execute that function, and those books are going to be put into this books variable here. Then if both of these execute correctly, and it's true for both of them, we can say that we want to render that authors page now, so we'll call this render function. We want to render authors/show, which we just created, and then we need to pass it those variables. So we'll pass it the author, and then we're going to pass it the books by author. Remember, this variable right here needs to be exactly the same as the variable we created in our show page. As you can see, books by author and books by author. And this is just going to be associated with our books variable we created right here. Now, lastly, let's remove the send that we had in here, save it, go back to our page, zoom it in, and if we click view, and you'll see that we're actually being redirected to the home page. And this is because we're ending up in our catch here, which means something in our try is not working. Now, these can be really difficult to debug problems, so the easiest way to do that is to add our optional parameter to catch. This catch just passes in an error here, and we can log that error. So we'll just say console.log error, and now if we go back and click that view button, we'll see our error right here. It says reference error, books is not defined, and it tells us exactly where this occurs. As you can see, it is occurring on this line right here, and it's because we're using this books variable instead of our book.find. Now let's save that, go back here, click the view button again, and you'll see we're getting another error that's saying book is not defined. And that's because we never actually imported our book up here. So let's import book, just like we did with library. So we'll say book right here. Now if we save that, come back down here to our Git right there, and everything looks pretty good. So let's try running that one last time. We'll just click view, and you'll see now it's correctly bringing us to our page here. We have the author name, the edit delete button, as well as all the books for that particular author. So now that we have that done, let's remove this code here because we don't actually want to log things in production. If we save that, go back, just make sure it's all still working, and it is, and we can view our other author as well right here, which is perfect. And if we go in here, we can even make sure this edit link is working, which it is, and the delete link is working because it won't actually let us delete this author since they have books. And if we go to our other author, for example, John, view him, and delete, and you can see he's gone because there's no books associated with him. Now let's finally commit all of these changes to Git. So we'll say git add, do a git commit. With our commit message, we'll just say finished author routes, commit that, and then finally all we need to do is run git push. So we'll say git push. This is going to push it to our remote repo on GitHub, and then we want to push to Heroku. So we'll say git push Heroku master. And now that that's finished, let's open it up in Heroku, and we can see that we're on Heroku and everything is working just fine. If we go to our author section, we can view our author, which is perfect. We can edit them, change their name, update it. You'll see that the name gets changed and so on. We can't delete this author since they have books for them, and everything's working perfectly. And with that, all of the routes for our author page are complete and working. In the next video, we're going to do the exact same thing for books by creating the show, update, edit, and delete views. And with that video, it's going to completely finish out all of the backend work that we need to do for this web page. So make sure you check out that video, which will be linked over here when it's available, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more videos in this series. Thank you guys very much for watching, and have a good day.